this is Father Vogel. We continue our series of St. Francis de Sales Introduction to the Devout Life. We are in part 3 looking at the different virtues. And now in the next few chapters, St. Francis is going to look at the 3 evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So these evangelical counsels are proposed to all by Christ himself in the Scriptures. And they are the 3 vows that those in religious life will make: a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And even though this work, Introduction to the Devout Life, is not specifically for those that have taken the vows, but rather for just the regular person, St. Francis does say that even though it's not necessary for us to take the vows in order to practice these 3 virtues, he says all of us are obliged to practice them in some way. So all 3, poverty, chastity, and obedience, we want to practice, though not in the same manner as those who have received religious life, but according to our own state in life, we want to practice them. So these 3 are, of course, founded upon charity. Charity is, of course, the highest virtue. It's one of the 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity, or love. And so these 3 are from that. So he says that charity alone establishes us in perfection, but obedience, chastity, and poverty are the 3 great means of acquiring perfection. Obedience consecrates our will, chastity our body, and poverty our material possessions, all to the love and service of God. So we're going to have separate chapters for each of these 3 virtues. So he says that obedience consecrates our will. So obedience is going to be having our will united with that of our Lord. So he says that there are 2 kinds of obedience. There is necessary obedience as well as voluntary obedience. So we'll consider both of these. First is necessary obedience, and that is the obedience that we owe to our legitimate superiors, whether it be church superiors such as the Pope, our bishop, the pastor, the priest, whether it be civil authorities that have a legitimate role in governance, that we should certainly obey the rules and laws of the place where we live, as well as our different superiors in our own house. So, for example, that would be those our parents, for example. So he says that when it comes to obeying superiors, our legitimate superiors, that no one is allowed to exempt ourselves from the duty of obeying those superiors, since God is the one who has given them the authority that they have. So he says that we should obey them in whatever they ask of us, whether it's pleasant things that we find very easy and we have no problem with obeying, or when it's with indifferent things where we really don't care one way or another, or when it's even unpleasant or difficult things that they're asking of us that we should try to obey. He says to obey gently, without retort, promptly, without delay, and cheerfully, without murmuring. So we want to obey in such a way as we aren't complaining back to them. And so, think of a child responding to parents. Oftentimes that may be the way the child may respond. But he says also, if we want to do better at being able to learn to obey a legitimate authority, he says to also place yourself to obey even those that aren't necessarily, don't have that role. So he says, to learn to obey your superiors easily, comply readily with the will of your equals. So if somebody that's your equal asks you to do something that it's reasonable to do, then to try to comply with that. And he says also, accommodate yourself willingly also to the wishes of your inferiors. To be a servant in a sense to others can help us to learn obedience. So that's necessary obedience. He continues and talks about voluntary obedience. So voluntary obedience is that to which we bind ourselves by our own choice and which is in no way imposed on us by another. So obviously, due to our state in life and the individuals that are superiors, there are things we must obey, but then there's other cases in which we impose certain things that we choose ourselves. So especially in this context, it's, for example, if you have a confessor or a spiritual director that you have placed yourself under and they have given you certain direction to do, that you should obey the advice, the counsel of the confessor or spiritual director. As well as, it can be in the form of certain spiritual exercises that we place upon ourselves, that we decide, this is what this is what I'm going to try to do. So for example, to obey the decision we make for the good practices of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving that we want to do during the Lenten season. He says that blessed are the obedient, for God will never let them go astray. So if we want to know what God's will is, what the path should be that we should take to obey our legitimate superiors, will help guide us in that direction. And even though this isn't from St. Francis de Sales, I want to add just a little bit from St. Maximilian Kolbe. In one of his letters, he has a section on obedience that I really appreciate and thought I would share as well during this reflection. So St. Maximilian Kolbe says that through his representatives on earth, God continually reveals his will to us. Thus, it is obedience, and obedience alone, that is a sure sign to us of the divine will. A superior, it is true, may make a mistake, but it is impossible for us to be mistaken in obeying a superior's command. The only exception to this rule is the case of a superior commanding something that would contravene God's law. Such a superior would not be conveying God's will. So, if we listen to that, he says there's really only one instance where we would not obey a legitimate superior, and that's when they're asking us to do something that's against God's law. So if it's explicitly against God's law, obviously that's not God's will, and they're making a mistake. But in other cases, if it's not specifically against God's will, but we just disagree with them, and we believe that they're making a mistake in having us do something, we are still better off spiritually obeying them, even though we disagree with them, even though we might think, I don't think that's right. I mean, there's many cases where saints, were trying to do God's will, and then their superiors tried to kind of squash it and stop them from doing it. And those that are saints, they submitted themselves to their legitimate superiors and may have to wait and be patient, and eventually God's will follow through. And so that's the same thing that we ought to do as well when we're trying to know what is God's will for us. It's always going to be better to obey than to try to obey those legitimate superiors, especially those of the church, rather than try to form our own path, because that kind of pride in myself will often lead us away from God rather than toward. God bless.